Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining today's series webinar. Today we're going to be discussing open source and age-appropriate design for children. We have a great, exciting lineup here. Just to go over a few housekeeping items, all of the attendees will be muted. This is a one-way broadcast. This broadcast will be recorded, and the recording will be distributed in the next few days from IEEE. If you're experiencing any technical issues, any AV or visual issues, there's a chat feature at the bottom of your screen. You could go ahead and type a message and we will be troubleshooting and assisting you there. We would love for your interaction and your questions to be integrated into today's presentation. So feel free to enter any questions that you may have into the Q&A feature, which is also along the bottom toolbar of your Zoom feature. Again, all technical questions direct to the chat feature and questions to the Q&A feature. We look forward to this session and thank you again for joining. Now, Dr. Ravi Robson will be kicking off today's talk.
Yeah, thanks, Jen, and welcome everybody. So my name is Ravi Robson. As it shows up there, I'm the Chief Science Officer and co-founder of EduWorks. I'm also on the IEEE Standards Association Board of Governors and have been leading the efforts in open source. I'd like to remind you that we do have, as well as this webinar, we have an event coming up on the 1st and 2nd of November at the Computer History Museum. We'll remind you that again at the end of the webinar. So let's go to the next slide. And what I'd like to do is to start with a little bit of an overview of what we're doing at IEEE Standards Association with open source. We have a rather broad definition of open source. So it's up there on the screen. You can see open source is a digital work in which the human readable source code is available for making modifications, but we include not only software, but also hardware. So designs, open source designs, as well as things like data, documentation, documents, and other digital objects. And we are interested in open source for the benefit of humanity. The IEEE mission is advancing technology for the benefit of humanity. So we're interested in open source for this area. And this particular webinar, I think, is particularly germane to that. And if we go to the next slide, we have some very distinguished speakers today. We have Katina Michael from Arizona State University, Leonda Barrington-Leach from the Five Rights Foundation. And we've been working at IEEE with the Five Rights Foundation for some time. And Sarah Wormer, who is a open source intelligence OSINT expert and is also a member of our open source committee. And last but not least, Moira Patterson, who is an IEEE staff member and is the global market affairs in standards partnerships. And I'm going to turn it over to her to talk a little bit about what IEEE is doing and then the rest of the panelists. I will say the panelists are going to self-introduce themselves. So without any further ado, Moira, it's over to you.
Thank you, Robbie. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you for joining this webinar on this very important topic. IEEE SA has, for several years now, been working in this important space of looking at age-appropriate design with a focus on children and young people. And of course, nowadays, it is very much in the news with a lot of concerns around how technologies from AI to general social media are impacting our young people. And you'll be hearing more about that from our distinguished experts today. IEEE SA has been viewing this as a really important part of our mission, which is advancing technology for the benefit of humanity. And we have been looking into this space, into helping create practical ways of moving from the principles and the policies into implementable solutions that the technologists can implement in their products and in their services, and that businesses can, consider as they even envision their products and services for children and young people. And so as part of that portfolio of work, we have been developing standards, and you'll be hearing today about the standards for age-appropriate design. That is a cornerstone In fact, that standard is also serving as a foundation for a new recommendation that actually was published today in Europe. It was contextualized for the European context, and we very much look forward to uptake of that in the future and serving potentially as a European standard in the future as well. In addition to standards, we have also been creating applied case study reports. Those are examples of how organizations currently are addressing challenges around age-appropriate design and around children's data privacy and those important topics. Again, our goal is to be able to help contextualize, help provide practical solutions. IEEE does bring the technical community to this table, and so we are really trying to both help educate the technical community on the importance of the topic, as well as bring the technical expertise to the policy discussion. And so we've been doing both, and in today's webinar, we also have people representing the different angles, and I think that will be very informative to all of our attendees today, I hope. So with that, I would encourage you all to look at these items. I will put a link in the chat later where you can access all of these items. If you are interested in engaging in any of these, from age-appropriate design to online age verification and assurance and other topics, please do email me. I'll put my email in the chat as well. We would love to hear from you and engage with you afterwards. I will also encourage you to please put your any questions you have along the way in the Q&A. We will be having an interactive session at the end and taking questions in the panel discussions, but please start putting them in as your questions come up, and we look forward to having an engaging dialogue with everyone here today. And with that, I will pass it on to our next speaker, Leanda.
Before you do that, though, I just want to encourage everybody to ask questions. There is a Q&A panel that you should be able to open to ask questions, and also if you need to, also just put it in the general chat. I'm sorry about that, but we try to be as interactive as possible, so feel free to ask questions. Thanks.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. If there's a problem, let me know, or let me know in the chat. My name is Leanda. I'm very grateful to Robbie and to Moira and to all of those who have set up this webinar for inviting me today. So as said, my name is Leanda Barrington-Leach. I'm director at the Five Rights Foundation. Five Rights is an international NGO with the mission to build the digital world that children and young people deserve. For that, as an organization, we work very closely with children. We also do our own research. The core of our work is really to provide expert support to regulators and policymakers around the world in the drafting of policy, legislation, regulation in this space. But we also do quite a bit of work on standards, as Robbie mentioned and Moira mentioned. Also, we have done, in particular, work with the IEEE on the standard 2089 on age-appropriate design, as well as the 20891 on age assurance. And we're also starting work with CENELAC, the EU standardization organization, on these same topics, as well as on others such as AI-enhanced nudging, where it's relevant for children. So I have been asked today to speak about the global context and policy developments in the field of age-appropriate design, to set the scene for a more in-depth discussion on the role of open source, which I myself am very eager to learn more about, so I'm looking forward to the other speakers. But coming back to what I'm going to do, I plan to do indeed just that. So first, look at the context and the issues, and then look at the policy developments in this space to date and moving forward, and we can discuss more on the relevance, if you like, in the discussion thereafter. So regarding the global context and the issues, as Moira said, child online safety is really a hot topic right now. If you think, for example, at Biden's last State of the Union, he brought it up. Macron has launched this international laboratoire pour la protection de l'enfance en ligne, so laboratory to protect children online. Commissioner Breton has made it very clear that the children's piece is top priority for implementation of the EU's Digital Services Act, etc. I could go on. I think that politicians have really woken up to the fact that about 90% of parents, and thus a hefty proportion of their voters, are very much concerned about the safety of their children online. This is in the context of an increasing number of media stories of children, for example, dying during viral challenges, committing suicide after going down social media rabbit holes, and the such, and also exploding cases of child sexual exploitation and abuse online, which in particular increased during the pandemic. So these concerns about children's physical safety are really a key driver, given, of course, our primal fear that something really awful might happen to our children. But there is also a growing awareness and concern about perhaps the less sensational but more ubiquitous impacts. So similarly, high numbers of parents and also very high proportions of children themselves cite addiction to screens as a major problem. They really feel it unduly influences their thoughts, their behavior, exploits them for commercial gain, exposes them to people and content and behavior that they do not welcome, such as bullying, harassment, hate speech, disinformation, and of course, sexual abuse. I'll give you just a couple of figures so you can grasp the scale of this. So 4 in 10 children say they rarely disconnect from social media. Various studies find between 1/3 and half of children worry themselves that they're addicted to the internet. 40% also of teenagers say images on social media have recently caused them to worry about their body image. Nearly 60% of girls have been harassed or abused online. 80% of girls say it's common to be put under pressure to provide sexual images of themselves. And another stat, 10% of 12 to 13-year-olds say that they are addicted to porn. There are loads of stats out there. I just pick a couple to give you a bit the image behind it. So where's this coming from? What's behind this? I think the answer, so the perils are becoming more and more clear, but the understanding of the root causes of what is behind it is also becoming more and more clear. So if you think, what do the Cambridge Analytica and disinformation scandals have in common with this explosion of online child sexual abuse? And the answer is that they exploit or are enabled by digital design that essentially has put profits over safety and rights. So yes, there are bad people out there. Yes, children are also busy exploring and perhaps they're up to no good some of the time. But really the way these popular digital products and services, where most children spend most of their time, the way they're designed pushes the risks far beyond the reasonable. So it really gives a platform to some of the worst of human nature and exploits our vulnerabilities. And of course, those who suffer the most are children, and in particular, the most vulnerable children. To put it simply, the data economy is an attention economy. Many of you probably are familiar with the kind of briefs that designers are given. The typical brief that we find from our research speaking to designers in tech companies is that they are tasked with optimizing products and services for 3 primary purposes, which are all geared towards revenue generation. The first is to maximize time spent on the service, capturing as much of a user's attention as possible. The second is to maximize reach and draw as many people into their product as possible. The third is to maximize activity by encouraging as much content generation and interaction as possible. So typical design features used to reach these objectives include push notifications, endless scrolling feeds, quantifying and displaying popularity, making it easy to share, in-app or in-game purchases, and making it easy to connect, for example, with friends or follower suggestions. I'm going to pause. I'm going to say, I know I'm going quite fast, but I will share my speaking notes for anyone who wants facts and figures and to take that away with them. I'm also now going to show just a couple of really short videos to highlight 2 examples of the impact of some of those features on social media. So bear with me. I hope this works. I'm going to share my screen.
Research experiments show how quickly a child can be nudged towards harmful content online. Wattpad is a popular fan fiction site used by children. After typing the first 3 letters of Wattpad into TikTok, the autocomplete options suggest erotic content. Typing the term depressed into Instagram produces these suggested hashtags. Typing the term restricting into TikTok produces these recommended autocompletes, including restricting calories, restricting food, and themes covering binging, dieting, and ED, meaning eating disorder. Typing the letters SELFH into TikTok produces recommended autocompletes, including self-hatred scars, self-harming relapse. TikTok says it doesn't allow content depicting, promoting, normalizing, or glorifying activities that could lead to suicide, self-harm, or disordered eating.
I'm going to show one more. This is part of a series. There are many more of these videos. I'm just going to show you these 2. Here's the second.
This click journey through content and hashtags on TikTok shows how easily we were led from one theme to another. From searching trampolining videos to weight loss exercise to thin body skinny the content about safe foods, which is an eating disorder term, to a video of someone discussing their own eating disorder, to SH, which indicates self-harm, to videos showing graphic scarring and discussions of self-harm. From a starting point of trampolining videos, we were exposed to weight loss material and nudged towards eating disorder and self-harm content in less than 15 clicks.
Okay. So as I say, there are more videos like that, and if you want to know more about typical features and their risk for children, I will share some links also to some publications and a microsite called Risky by Design, which is quite useful in the chat after this. So I think what's clear is that at the moment, the problem is a feature, not a bug of the system. And please note also, this is not just about social media. Think about gaming, think hard also about education technology that is now ubiquitous in classrooms increasingly around the world. So the question, second part, what are the policymakers and regulators doing about it? I said before that a main driver was the desire to protect children, in particular from the most horrific harms. And as people realize that the digital world is not a safe space for kids, the knee-jerk reaction is often to keep kids out. So before, it was all about what a wonderful space the internet was and how we should educate children and their parents to be good digital citizens, to behave, to stay safe and participate in a positive way. But now, as we realize that it's a bit out of control, the proposals are swiftly coming in for compulsory parental controls, stringent parental consent processes, age verification, time limits in China, for example, or for banning kids altogether from certain services, and that's in the US in particular. The other path of much action at the moment is content moderation, scanning, reporting and removal, whether of disinformation, hate speech, or child sexual abuse material, for example. And as you are perhaps aware, neither of these approaches, keeping kids out or keeping the content clean, has been or is likely to be very effective. They're also not very rights respecting. From the point of view of children's rights, I will point to the right to privacy, also privacy from parents, the right to access to information, the right to education, the right to free speech, etc. These approaches also broadly miss the point that the digital world, when children access it, which they're going to, remains toxic because its design logic left as such continues to promote pain if it delivers profit. And as I said, the problem is a feature, not a bug of the system, so the solution must be at the level of the system. Thus, the focus in other approaches on data protection and age-appropriate design. So this is really a whole other approach and has become the primary focus of pretty much all activists trying to reshape the internet for the betterment of humanity. It happened rather naturally as organizations, big and small, realized that they were addressing the symptoms and ignoring the underlying cause of whatever they were trying to address. So I personally was part of the EU's anti-disinformation team when we realized that the war that we were fighting was pitting us less against foreign agents rather and more against the machine itself. It was the machine who was offering up the really big fight. So forget content moderation, as long as they could game the machine, we would always lose. So activists and others took a look at how to regulate the machine, as in system design. For kids, the key lever was GDPR, the European Data Protection Regulation. And at Five Rights, we asked, what is fair and transparent data protection and data processing when the user is a child? Is it okay to profile a child for profit? Is it okay to share their location, to share their personal information with strangers? Is it okay to send them constant nudges and notifications, and so on? The Age-Appropriate Design Code, which is a regulatory code under GDPR, was passed in the UK in 2020, and it set out 15 standards for children's data protection. Its core principles have since been taken up by policymakers and regulators around the world. The Irish DPA embedded them in its interpretation of GDPR, as did the French, the Swedish, the Dutch. And last year, California passed its own age-appropriate design code, and 4 other states in the US are considering codes at the moment. In Washington, KOSA, the Kids Online Safety Act, is heavily inspired by this approach in the AADC, although it does not meet all of the standards. Indonesia is finalizing its AADC, and it's also been introduced in Argentina. In the EU, the Digital Services Act, the AI Act, the Regulation on Child Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, they all follow the safety and privacy by design and default principles, and they recognize the higher bar for children. The Council of Europe's AI Treaty will also likely embed this. In a few weeks, the African Union will adopt the world's first comprehensive child online safety policy, imbibed with the same principles of corporate responsibility for product safety. So I'm wrapping up. I think just in conclusion to say we are making progress, but there are still headwinds and there are still divergent approaches. And this is really a big risk because different standards around the world creates regulatory loopholes, and tech firms will exploit this, which is not to be, well, would not be surprising, right? And also, even if they do want to comply, it's much more difficult if you have a patchwork of regulatory requirements. So we need regulatory alignment. We need global standards. It's a global problem. It has to have a global solution. Some of those standards are already there with the IEEE 2089, 2091. And I'm really looking forward to discussing with the other panelists and with you where we go from here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Leander from Five Rights, a wonderful foundation and a great talk. I'll be dovetailing off of Leander's talk and talking about the Five Rights framework with respect to open source software. My name is Katina Michael. I'm a professor at Arizona State University. I'm in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society and also the School of Computing and Augmented Intelligence. I'm also the director of the Society Policy Engineering Collective called SPEC, and I was the working group chair for the standard we're talking about today, IEEE 2089.2021. I want to begin by reiterating the 5 rights of children as identified by Five Rights: to recognize child users and meet their needs, to uphold the rights of children, to be child-centered with respect to an approach to data use for moderation and redress, and also presenting published terms in age-appropriate formats. That's in fact what we want to achieve. But let's go and see the connection between IEEE 2089 and potentially this notion of open source. Could we focus on the problem space as well as the typical solution space that we've always been working in with OSS? Just a quick recap here of what are the fundamental principles of OSS, and you'll find these on any documents regarding open source software and open source initiatives, open source intelligence. It is that of transparency, and that is the main thing that we will be talking about today with respect to open source and children's standards, especially when we're designing digital services with children, not for them. Collaboration with respect to all the different stakeholders that would come together to offer solutions in this space. The release of early and as often as possible iterations, small iterations and changes ongoingly, continuously of open source matter. Participation, all-inclusiveness, multi-stakeholder approach, community at large. This is not just the end users, in this case, children, those who are under the age of 18, according to the rights of the Convention on the Child, but also other stakeholders like parents and guardians, schools, and those that are related either directly or indirectly to the digital design of digital services. And then this notion of open versus closed software. Currently, we're seeing a lot of commercial activity, particularly, as Leander mentioned, in social media and other spaces to do with digital services targeted at children, but also the mass market. What is closed is not transparent. What is closed is proprietary, and potentially what we'd like to see are things being more open and accessible to investigation and interrogation, particularly with respect to the rights of a child, whether it's terms and conditions, in very simplistic manners, being able to be communicated to them and to be understood by children of any age, not just those that are teenagers, but also young kids who may be accessing digital services online. But also, what is the allure of open source? It is that lower costs and overhead. It is that potential for design and development done by many with relevant expertise that would shortcut some of the barriers and challenges that we do find with coding and development. We do say there is better security in open source software. More specialists come on board with different kinds of approaches to security, ensuring that data that is collected is maintained and the best techniques are put forward. No vendor lock-in, and that's a very difficult one for our commercial entities that may be tuned in today listening, who potentially want stickiness drivers for children and others to return back to their platform. But perhaps we can look at routines, subroutines, modules, and classes for a given feature set or function. Perhaps we don't want to give away everything in an open source way, but perhaps we could look at some of those features that are recurring and may be able to be unlocked and open. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And often open source offers us better quality products, less number of bugs, has been proven against other commercial software. But when we start to look at this, we're shifting our mindset to a new design philosophy that is emergent. I mean, the great Don Norman and many other designers have talked about the human-centered design approach, but there are some measures of alignment with open source initiatives. And on the left, you can see the four main principles of human-centered design. To be people-centered, in this case, we can say we can be children-centered in the design of our software and systems. We focus on the right problem and the root cause, and Leander identified a number of known problems there out in the web sphere, and how we might actually look at the right problem, define it correctly and appropriately, and look at the root cause. Through various means, we may be looking at shifting mental models rather than building for the mass market, building with children and other stakeholders. A systems thinking approach, and as we already mentioned, an iterative process looking at simple interventions with quite significant outcomes. For example, this auto-scrolling capability or this location-based capability, perhaps simply we turn these features off, and this has a major positive effect on people's well-being, particularly children. But then we look at the right-hand side and look at the benefits of open source software initiatives, and you can see community building. This is a type of people centricity when we look at alignment and compatibility between the human-centered design philosophy and also the benefits of open source. Participation, yes, multi-stakeholder capabilities, flexibility, definitely, and lower starting costs, faster project beginnings, and faster iterations, which hopefully lead to a longer lasting product. On the next slide, I posit here the double diamond, that which is well known for those of us in the human-centered design space, which begins with 4 phases: the discover, define, develop, and deliver, the end-to-end problem space in the first diamond and solution space in the second. Traditionally, we've focused on the second space, that second diamond, where we develop in the open source context and build software and roll it out and continue to improve it over time. But what we are posing here with Dr. Roba Abbas, who's helped in preparing this presentation slides, is that we need to look at the end-to-end development process. It's not enough to look at the solution space. We need to begin to start thinking about open source initiatives at that problem space, there at the outset, at the discover, where we have insight into the problem through various empathy techniques, and then define that area to focus upon, knowing what the actual right problem to solve is through root cause analysis and iceberg models and mental models and patterns and trends that are appearing, and looking at the structural design of things where we start to ideate. And it's at this crucial front stage where in the IEEE 2089 standard, we are basically saying this is a time that you can create an age-appropriate risk register, an AARR, where you can basically say, okay, well, we've identified the problem, we've identified the capacity and capability to innovate, we are looking at these particular features that we want to roll out. Let's consult with our constituents. Let us co-design together with stakeholders, not just children, but also parents, schools, teachers, guardians, and the rest of the community. Let's come up with an early intervention strategy to those things that we know will not work and will exacerbate existing problems to do with a youth's well-being or a child's well-being. And let's address that in the problem space in that first diamond as an open source initiative. Now, how might we do that? We might invite people to create registers of known risks, registers of known penalties, which we can see in the case law, and create a variety of evidence-based approaches that we know are tried and tested. And we do that by community. It's not a one-size-fits-all across the globe, but we're talking about customizing through open source initiatives. And the open source is not code. The open source is consultation and feedback that's coming from our stakeholders, and that is stored somewhere in a live setting that's dynamic, can be updated, and can be used to inform future projects. Now, a typical risk could be treated, and therefore we allow that particular open source initiative to be rolled out through the develop and deliver second diamond in the solution space. But this is a very interesting phenomenon we really have not heard much about. I think we are posing this, I dare say for the first time, that we start to shift our notion of open source software, not simply to development and code, but in fact, that beginning first diamond space. A typical open source initiative, however, in the solution space could well be what we are seeing play out at the moment in the IEEE 2089.1 standard, which is about age verification. We may be able to roll out open source software. All digital services for children require age verification. Otherwise, we don't know the age of a child. We have been fraught with fear to pass on digital imagery of children, whether it's biometrics, whether it's other facial recognition techniques, whether it's typing age, whether it's knowing the voice of somebody online and knowing their age, because biometrics are unique to the individual. However, there are privacy enhancing techniques and technologies and approaches we could use if we trusted a transparent and open system to be able to verify a child, by definition, one who is under the age of 18. Now, this kind of subroutine, this kind of class or library could be called upon as a function, and we could see this as an open source initiative that all companies have access to, and users and stakeholders know what is actually being called, what is being stored, how the data is being used, how the data is being manipulated for the upkeeping of the fundamental rights of a child's privacy. And that's something that I think we need to think deeply about, because it's relevant across the board. In particular to 2089, there are many different areas. If we look at the end-to-end process that's defined in the standard, the preparatory stage, looking at the 5 rights principles implementation, with B1 there on the implementation of the age-appropriate digital framework, going to B2 with the identification of the risk-based age-appropriate register, and then to C on the right-hand side there on operations and maintenance. There are many opportunities for open source software initiatives to take place that are recurring, whether that's knowing how we may uphold data protection, whether that's in terms that are fair and legal, whether that's in various opportunities such as tolerable risks and hazards, and those that are intolerable and how we would treat those. But whether it's playing in the problem space or in the solution space, what we are saying is we now have a very different philosophical twist through co-design and the human-centered design approach to actually look at this union between open source software and standards like 2089, at least to a degree. We're not saying that there is an end-to-end, everything should be open, but for the greater part, there are many opportunities with which we could come in and create an open source initiative, for example, in the age verification process. On my last slide, I'd love to trigger some thoughts from our listeners today. I want to ask you directly, and please, I'd love to see your responses in the chat. I would like to say, do you think human-centered design can be applied to the open source context? What are the benefits and barriers to open source with respect to the problem space and the solution space when designing digital services for children, or I should say, with children? Should we be consulting other stakeholders, not merely technology companies, and should that data be stored somewhere openly and transparently? What role do open source human-centered design toolkits play in your eyes? And if you are in charge of implementing 2089 in a commercial setting, what would you focus on with respect to open source software, and why? And I'd also like to learn from you, do you believe companies would be willing to share their learnings from innovation processes they have engaged in with respect to children's digital services? Why and why not? If you feel like answering these questions in the chat, please go. I would love to have dialogue with you while we are speaking today. If not, let's hold those questions to the end. Thank you.
Okay, so Sarah, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hello, my name is Sarah Wilmer. I am an open source intelligence practitioner with over 24 years of online expertise and research. And also I'm a senior analyst with Plessis Expert Network, Inc. And I'm a volunteer with IEEE SA Open. I also am an advocate and enthusiast of open source for good and human rights. And I'm passionately engaged with youth digital responsibilities, ethics, and safety. And I just wanted to mention how I got passionately engaged. The reason I first became passionately engaged in youth online and youth safety online was I used to look at terrorists online. So when I was looking at terrorists online, I did notice a pattern of teens looking at terrorist websites, which is dealing with recruitment and indoctrination. In 2002, I did author an article for the Encyclopedia of Terrorism on how terrorists use the internet. And I looked at that topic for many years. I also wanted to mention, because I heard Miss Leanda mention that she was on a counter disinformation team. I did that in 2002, 2003, and briefly in 2004 at the Strategic Communications Office at State Department. I was on a counter disinformation team. And at that time, there wasn't a huge emphasis on the topic as there is today. And that's just simply because there's, it's more easy for people to spread it. So on to the next slide, please. So as mentioned by the prior speakers, there is an absence or lack of effective age-appropriate design at this time. The age design that primarily exists right now in today's environment, in many countries, many institutions, and many schools, is an emphasis on surveillance. And there's not so much of an emphasis on child empowerment and learning digital responsibility and ethics. And I really like the comments that were made by both speakers on engaging the children in the process so they are empowered and that they have a part of their responsibility of being in the digital environment. And for example, one thing that I wanted to bring up as an example is I'm also a mom. My son's school currently gives him a Chromebook, so school data is not confused with the home system. However, that data is still collected by the school in at least one company occurring on off-school hours. That's not normal just to my son, that's normal to a whole bunch of kids in the United States. If he does not use that system, or if he does not use the portal or the environment that the school has given to him for studying or doing academic activities, they might actually rate him as not being academically inclined or being interested in whatever the topic is or scholastic participation. The exact degree and duration of what has been collected on my child and most other people's children is opaque. And the reason I say it's opaque is that I can't really get a copy of what's collected on my child from the school, or what's collected on the child from the company. And what is that data that's being collected actually being used for? I don't know. And then I noticed that in COVID, not just my child, but lots of children, were being monitored via Microsoft Teams, and educators would comment and correct conversations between children on Teams in virtual free time. So if you think about it, if you were on a playground as a child and you're with your friends and you're talking and you're chatting and you have an adult watching right over your shoulder, correcting you every single second when you do something wrong, that's not a natural environment. In addition, you can add that to the things like the tracking and the browser fingerprinting that occurs not just from schools and institutions, but when a child visits a website. So when we go to looking at all of that, and you think about these, the tracking and the browser fingerprinting, which was mentioned by the first speaker, is advertising agencies and companies aren't really discriminating the data based on the perceived age. And if they are basing the data on the perceived age, some of them are actually making extrapolations on future behavior patterns. And then that also raises a question of, do parents and teachers know all of the other parents, guardians, and caretakers who have access to all of the other children's school accounts or data? And this is looking at it from an institutional perspective of schools. Typically, the answer is no. So even if one parent has access to one kid's data, that means that a total stranger might have access to everybody else's data by looking at the one kid's data. So I noticed that it was, sorry, I have some voice dysphonia. I noticed that in one instance, somebody was hiding the parents' email addresses when somebody was trying to send out a birthday invitation. And this is a simple example, but the child and every other child's email address was viewable in that child's class account. So even though the parent was being protected, the children were not. And that extrapolates out farther to some of the other things that both speakers were talking about in how do you protect the child's data. And the next thing I wanted to mention is many of the platforms that exist that are being utilized by schools and institutions and parents and kids, they're based on platforms that, from an open source intelligence perspective, may be legally exploitable through email query tools. So for example, if somebody is using a Gmail-based tool, there's lots of OSINT tools that you can use to get the metadata from that Gmail-based tool. If the Gmail is being used by a child, that means that anybody who has access to OSINT-based tools can get that child's metadata, which goes back to what the first speaker said on drilling down sometimes to somebody's physical location. Now, I want to extend all these things I talked about very quickly, because I know we're on a time crunch, is to other things. So we already all discussed the things that were on the internet, but when you combine, the child's access to the internet from their computer to their smartphone, to their tablets, to their smart watches, to IoT, the Internet of Everything, and when all those things are synced together, you have even a broader problem of how do you make age-appropriate design. So how do you make age-appropriate design in the age of IoT, or the Internet of Everything? Then when you look at on top of that layer, you add that the child's parents might be querying information about their child, such as parenting information, medical information, how to deal with the flu or a cold. All of that could be aggregated with everything that's been mentioned prior. Then let's add to that the consent form that a parent signed for the child to be shown on school social media and the parent's public post of that child on Instagram. In other words, our children are currently, in the ones that are in the digital divide, they are currently in a fishbowl. Now let's add non-family members and strangers. The bus driver tuned from a school can oftentimes record all children on a bus. A child throws a tantrum and the store, a random person, can film it. And anything can be taken out of context when it's only shown in bits. A child can throw, and I've seen an example of this, a child can throw a piece of litter on the ground in front of someone's Ring camera, and that clip is then posted on Nextdoor by a stranger who then critiques that child's parents for bad parenting. It's kind of crazy, huh? So when you're looking at that, and I know gaming and social media was added before, I could spend over an entire hour simply on personality profiling through free gaming. Or not only that, personality profiling through what kind of games a child chooses to play. However, since we're almost out of time, I won't go there. But during COVID in the United States, Sensor Tower was able to show traffic patterns of who was driving during quarantine. They got that information from free apps such as games. That means that that kind of data, whether it's Pokemon Go or some other game, can be used for tracking kids, not just adults. And when you throw in social media, as mentioned for the first speaker, one of the things I wanted to mention with, as an example, is X, or formerly Twitter, states that it's appropriate for 13 years old. Facebook says it's appropriate for 13 years old. However, if I go into Facebook and I look at the content that I can come across on X, not Facebook, but on X, sometimes it's PG-13, sometimes it's R, and in fact, sometimes there's X on X. And the problem extends to many social media platforms. It's not just one, as the first speaker mentioned. And currently, with the war right now in Russia and Ukraine, there's a lot of information that's posted online that's graphic. And there's the actual killing of human beings being posted online. Historically, a human having a grenade thrown into their trench would not be televised on a social media platform with a cell phone. Today it is. The problem of dehumanizing real footage started to occur prior to September the 11th, 2001 on the World Wide Web. with websites like Orgish.com. But these types of posts did evolve with groups like Al Qaeda. And then what's happened is that was when there was just discussion forums, and now it's trickled over to, mainstream social media platforms. So now we have active shooters who can broadcast their activities in real time. That's a lot of things to look at when you're trying to figure out how to make children to have a safe space where they can be kids. And adults who are analysts and who look at extremist groups and bad actors like myself, who did when I did before, or law enforcement or work for national defense or something else, they already have appropriate risk mitigation measures to avoid vicarious trauma and PTSD placed in line for doing these kinds of online research and investigations. But the question is, how do you deal with that with a kid, with a child? There are no clear risk mitigation measures for vicarious trauma that are put in place for a 13-year-old who watches the real execution of another human on social media platform. And does it sound like a horrible thing? It is a horrible thing. Has it probably happened? Yes. And as mentioned before, catfishing is common. A 40-year-old can pretend to be 10 and talk to a 10-year-old. Every year, every day, and every few minutes, a predator reaches out to a child online. In many instances, the child does not know it is a predator. When the child does know it's a predator, sometimes there's manipulation for coercion or sextortion, which means that in an age-appropriate design, what are the protected reporting measures for the child where they can feel comfortable coming forth? And then when you look at that, we will also want to factor in the next step of looking at is screen time was mentioned. But in addition to screen time, were non-digital skills included into digital time? And I know that sounds a bit weird, but the example I'm going to throw out there is how many children right now are learning how to read a map, or for that matter, use a compass. For some of them, their parents don't even know how to read a map. And if their parent went to a different country, could that parent get from point A to point B without a cell phone or GPS? And that example brings me back to the actual design that the child would be engaged in, because I like that concept that Katina brought up of working with the child. Is how will the child see that design of going from point A to point B versus just wrote, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do. I press this button, it goes there. And then algorithms were inferred by, and were also mentioned as well. How do we make age-appropriate design for the algorithms of the search engines that are being accessed, or even through queries? And these are only just a few of many issues as it relates to the state of age-appropriate design that showcases the need for age-appropriate design and digital independence in addition to a safe environment. Next slide. So this slide, none of these children in this slide exist. All of these children are fake. So when a child goes online, how do they even tell what's reality? So when you're looking at age-appropriate design, the next question is, how do you implement in age-appropriate design cognitive security and information verification? Next slide. And on this one, that leads me to the next one, which is perception, rapport, and safety. In order to have a positive age-appropriate design for children, there also needs to be a perceived sense of safety for that design and a positive rapport with the source of the design, which goes back to one of the things Katina said with working together, the children and the adults on this, versus just an emphasis on surveillance. Next slide. So we do have the digital divides, and there's a lot of this emphasis has been on what children, the nasty things that children have access to. But what about that whole other set of 1/3 of children globally that don't have any access at home? how do we bridge that divide? Because it's there, and what do they need in the digital environment, or how can we push that digital environment out to them so that they can be that they can have the same STEM opportunities, science and technology opportunities as the others. Next slide. So if I look at, I've seen all three, from rotary phone to having a cell phone, to looking at, what's going on with IoT and now artificial intelligence, and things are going to keep going forward. What are those future projections that we're not thinking about that we should have kind of an open space in the digital design, or in a design plan for things that are evolving? And that leads me to my next slide, which I want to talk just a minute about artificial intelligence, and I hope I haven't gone over too much. On artificial intelligence, one of the things with artificial intelligence is right now the emphasis on that is that parents and schools and institutions, how do we protect the kids from it, and how do we make sure they're not using it incorrectly? But the thing is artificial intelligence can also be very empowering. So how does a child write an effective prompt for doing research for a paper? Good question, right? Or the other one is with art. There's a big debate right now, and I hear people saying, if somebody artificially generates something, it's not art. Well, I have a friend who's an artist who spends hours doing artificially generated art, and I'll tell you right now, it's art. But when you make a prompt that you've crafted, that you've spent half hour, an hour on to make a beautiful piece of art, is that not art? Or is because if you say that it's just artificial intelligence and it's not art, then you're ignoring the thought of the person who created it. So the point with that is, how do we implement with children how they can get the best out of AI, both visual, textual, audio, etc. Next slide. So most of the points on how to empower children through open source were covered with Katina. I think one of the big ones that we should look at on that is transparency, and also the cost effectiveness of it. So for example, in a digital divide, if you have open source that you are using, maybe you can use a part of it for FOSS for some of the kids that are being cut off on the digital divide. Or you can also use lower cost OS, open source, for some of those projects or programs. But the transparency is very important, because that way you can see where the code is going, and you can always go back and fix it, and there's no question about any kind of weird backdoors. But she also covered all of those points, so I don't want to be redundant on that. So, next slide. Okay, so all of the graphics in my presentation were created with DiffusionBee, and this person doesn't exist. None of the graphics or images in my presentation existed, and they were all AI created from my prompts. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. I think we have only 1 minute left, so I'd like to remind everybody that that we have this event coming up, 1st, 2nd November, Computer History Museum. If you have questions about that, please ask us. And I think I'd like Moira, if you'd like to close with just a comment or two about some of the work we're doing, I think that'd be great.
Okay, thank you. And the talks were excellent. Thank you so much for all the insights. And I wish we could take more questions, but we really appreciate everyone's attention. As we indicated, we would love for you to get engaged in the work, and you saw the variety of activities we have where people interested in this topic can get engaged, and we need folks from open source to standardization, all of those activities, and non-technical people bringing their expertise and passion as well. So again, please do look at our website or email us to get engaged. I also heard Katina's call for you know, really trying to address some of these solutions with open source. And that is something that we do want to instantiate. So please do reach out to us, do get in touch so that we can start tackling these important issues. You are hearing about the policy pushes around the world to look at these things in a responsible and empowering way. And I think the technology aspects have an important part to play in a balanced and considered way. And IEEE has really been building this community to work in that manner and in these spaces with the experts you heard today and others. So we look forward to hearing from you all, and thank you for your time.